Welcome to rePROs Fight Back, a podcast on all things repro. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and each episode I will be taking you to the front lines of the escalating fight over our sexual and reproductive health and rights at home and abroad. Each episode, I will be speaking with leaders who are fighting to protect our reproductive health and rights, to ensure that no one's reproductive health depends on where they live. It's time for rePROs to fight back. Welcome to rePROs Fight Back. Today we're going to talk about something we haven't talked about yet, and that is faith and reproductive rights. So often when you hear about reproductive rights from a faith point of view, you're only hearing from people who are against reproductive rights. But there is a lot of diversity in the faith movement, and a lot of faith traditions are really supportive of reproductive rights. So in that vein, I'm super excited to talk to the executive director of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, host of the Kindreds Podcast, and author of a brand new book, Women Rise Up, Sacred Stories of Resistance for Today's Revolution, Reverend Katey Zeh.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
Thanks for being here, Katie. I'm so excited we finally got to do this.
I know, we go way back, so it's really fun to get to have a conversation like this with you.
And I have also been following your podcast from the early days and really enjoy listening to that. But also, y'all, I have to tell you, I'm so excited. Last week, well, I guess now that when this comes out 2 weeks ago, Katie was on the West Wing Weekly talking about these amazing issues, and it was wonderful.
That was kind of a bananas moment, but really cool, and I was totally nerding out the whole time. So thanks for that shout out. It was really fun, and I've been surprised at how positive the response has been to that segment, and it just reinforces for me how important it is for people of faith to be talking out about their support for reproductive rights.
So I figured we'd start with your book that just came out. I just finished it, and I really enjoyed it. And it really made me think, thinking back, I don't know if we've ever had this conversation, but I grew up Catholic and went to Catholic school K through 8. So some of similar-ish stuff. And it just made me think back to you talk about not hearing women's stories when you were learning the Bible and were going to church. And that struck me as other than Mary and a very little bit, you just don't hear about the women at all.
Yeah. And to be fair, their stories are smaller, they're shorter, but they're still there. But they get strategically removed from the lectionary or from the text that's read out loud in church. And so a lot of the stories we don't know unless you've taken the time, which who has time to read through it yourself. But if you're leaning on religious authorities on a Sunday morning service to educate you about women in the Bible, you're probably not getting much of an education at all, which is why I wanted to write the book.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you also mentioned was just about the patriarchal structures that are definitely reinforced for sure in a Catholic religion where women definitely have no place in the power structure. And that really struck me when reading the whole book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the power of the patriarchy. And I guess what gives me hope, unlike some feminists who feel like the Bible just cannot be redeemed for feminist causes, which I totally understand, but for me, what I find hopeful is that even in this text that was written under very oppressive structures that, basically defined women by how many male children they could have, we still have these stories of women who found ways to survive and to resist and to kind of claim their sacred worth as women apart from their male progeny or their husbands. So in that way, I'm yes, we might not have a lot, but there's something there that we can hold on to and live into today for gender justice in our current world.
I think the story with the clearest example in my head when I was reading it was the story of the midwives in Egypt.
Yes, I love them.
That was really powerful. And for people who probably didn't know, because I'll be honest, I don't remember that part of that. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about that real quick?
Sure. So this is the first chapter of Exodus where the Egyptian Pharaoh is trying to basically control the Israelites by eliminating all of their baby boys. And so he commands the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill all of the baby boys after they're born, in the birthing room. And so what they do is they tell the Pharaoh, sorry, the Hebrew women just give birth so quickly that we aren't ever there in time. So they find a way to use their particular knowledge about what happens in the birthing room to protect the Hebrew women and their children. And it's just this great story. And of course, that's the lead up to the story of Moses. But I just love that they're so cunning and savvy and really risking a lot, because their lives could have been taken at any point for having disobeyed the Egyptian Pharaoh. But they just believed that their role was to protect. And I love that story. Yeah, they're some of my favorites too. So I'm glad you liked that one.
Yeah, that one really struck me. There were a number of them. One that I don't know so much the story struck me, but you're talking about it because I could relate hard to it, was, oh no, I'm not going to forget her name. No, because I don't think she has a name. The woman who came up and touched Jesus' robes.
Oh, yes, we don't know her name.
I don't go up to people and talk to them. I'm like, yes, exactly.
Yes, I'm super weird around people that have any kind of notoriety. I just get very... I don't know if it's shyness or just uncomfortable, awkward, and so I strategically avoid people in a room if I feel like they have any kind of like fame or name recognition. And so I've always been envious of people who just kind of put themselves out there, like this woman who really needed something that Jesus had, and rather than ask for permission, she just reaches out and gets it and heals herself. So maybe it'll make me a little bit more brave next time I want to talk to someone in a room.
I always resist. And I just, was listening, reading your stories. I'm like, yeah, no, exactly. I can see all of this happening where I would just be like, nope, can't talk to them. Mm-hmm. And then finally do, and something happens.
Right. And in that story too, she's kind of hoping to be sort of unseen, and so she reaches for the hem of the garment thinking that's the least visible thing that I can do, and then he feels something happen and he turns and says, "Who touched me?" And she had the option to leave, but she chooses to do the brave thing, which is to tell her entire story about what's happened to her, including these doctors who have tried to stop her bleeding and have only made her worse, and she spent all of her money. And then he calls her daughter and says, "Your faith has made you well." And I've always felt like, yeah, it's not really, Jesus is kind of passive in this story if you think about it. Like she's the catalyst for her healing, which I think has so much resonance for the kind of conversation that we're going to have today about the role of faith and women and reproductive rights.
So the other thing that really struck me, and you don't really talk about it, but I read it and I'm like, yes, I didn't even think that Katie and I needed to talk about this, was purity culture.
Oh, yes.
So again, Catholic schools, and so I don't know if I am too old and I missed the worst of it with like the purity rings and stuff, or if it wasn't as big where I was or within the Catholic Church, because yes, I had sex ed from a nun. Yes, it was very much abstinence only, but there wasn't the purity rings, and like you talk about a ceremony at your church or church group or something to get rings very publicly.
Yes.
And that's not something I had, and I think that's definitely something that's worth a conversation about. Yeah,
well, we can dive in there if you want.
Sure.
So I don't know, I guess we can talk about I was born in 1983, so this would have been in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I'm pretty sure that the kind of purity messages that I got were very much steeped in a curriculum that was coming out of the Southern Baptist Church, if I'm not mistaken. So probably you wouldn't have gotten it in the Catholic Church, but I was also not part of the Southern Baptist Church either. So I think they did a really good job of kind of sharing this curriculum and frankly, advertising it to youth leaders in the South in conservative or evangelical churches. And I was 13 years old. And frankly, was pretty naive. I hadn't really dated, right? You're 13, like in 8th grade or something like that. And the message was, in order to have a good marriage later in life, the rule was you could not have a sexual relationship with anyone until your wedding night. And the rules were very clear. And at 13, that sounded like a good idea to me. Marriage didn't seem like, I'll get married when I'm 22 or something like that. There was no prospect of having any kind of serious relationship. And I felt like, well, if this is going to guarantee me a happy marriage later in life, it seems like logical for me to take this pledge. And of course, all my friends were doing it. So there's the peer pressure part. But the funny thing about my purity ring ceremony is somehow my ring never got there. And so I actually I took the pledge, but I never wore the ring. And I don't know, there's probably symbolic stuff
funny.
there I could write about sometime. But I quickly found out as my friends got older, we went into college, and of course my own theology changed, but I had friends who got married following this purity culture very closely, and then ended up in really terrible marriages. And so all of that started to break down as I saw them getting divorced, sometimes from really violent situations, and just thinking, wow, the church really failed to tell us about what it meant to be in a healthy relationship with someone, not just the do's and don'ts, but how do you work through things and come through conflict? Like, those things were never discussed.
No, absolutely not.
It was just focused on like this very specific kind of sexual behavior. And I just think it does such a disservice, especially to young girls, but also to boys too.
At least mine was definitely framed in, like you mentioned, happiness, right?
Right.
Being abstinent and not having sex until you get married. That's how you have a happy marriage.
Right, exactly. It's kind of a fairy tale way of talking about relationships that, like fairy tales, is also not true.
Yeah, and I felt very unprepared for life, right? I didn't have a lot of those relationship skills or things that you should get in a much more comprehensive, evidence-based sex education, that like birth control, right? Like that was never talked about. And if it was like, condoms don't work, like it's not effective, like you shouldn't, like,
yes,
no, they don't work.
Right. And the other thing I've talked about with my friends who've gone through or immersed in purity culture is as we've gotten older and gotten married, and some of us have wanted to become pregnant, that we thought becoming pregnant was going to be so easy because the message was, if you have sex, you will get pregnant. And then, so what do we do then when actually getting pregnant on purpose is not as simple as we once thought, and really not having an understanding of how fertility works? So it's just kind of interesting to think about all the different ways in which purity culture is damaging, starting from adolescence, but kind of going all the way through into adulthood as well.
We mentioned birth control. That is definitely also something where you see certain faiths being weaponized to say that they're very much against birth control and they're in power right now. And those are the voices that are the loudest and that you're hearing from. But that's actually kind of a very minority held belief in the faith community, that you shouldn't use birth control, but that's what gets amplified. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think too, the conflation or confusion of contraception and abortion seems to be the tactic that they're trying now. Like, okay, well, certain methods are fine, but these other methods are abortifacients. They're not actually contraceptives. And I think that that's where they're trying to sort of like drive a wedge publicly and confusing people about how birth control works. And that's actually worked really well. And the other one, of course, is around religious freedom, and do employers have to provide contraception if it's like quote unquote against their religious beliefs. And again, that's been very, very successful. But yeah, I mean, in Protestant circles in which I work, birth control has never really been an issue. And in fact, growing up in the United Methodist Church, their position is that intentional parenting is actually a moral good, and so using contraception to plan if, when, and how many children is actually, being faithful to the call to make good moral decisions about our lives. And so I actually think there's like a whole lot of moral arguments to be made in favor of why birth control is good, in addition to women having the ability to like control their bodies and make moral decisions. But I think as a common good issue, it's like, it's good for people to be able to be very intentional about whether or not they want to parent.
Yeah, and that just reminds me of talking about religious refusal or objections to covering birth control. But there's kind of been a whole weaponization of using religious liberty as a corporate value, not a personal value. So the corporation can decide they don't want to cover birth control or cover things, and that's not an infringement on my personal religious liberty. It's on the corporate religious belief.
Right. So conflation of faith and power, both political power and economic power, is really problematic, especially if you return to the text itself. Like, that is not what, to me, as I read the Gospels, like, that is absolutely antithetical to what Jesus was talking about in terms of how we're supposed to live. It's not about gaining political power, economic power over others, and using faith language to manipulate and coerce people or control people. I don't know how people can disassociate the core messages of the faith. Like, the cognitive dissonance that has to happen there is really hard for me to wrap my mind around, but it's been very useful in upholding white supremacy and Christian nationalism and all of those things. But it's really disturbing, I think, for folks like me to see Christianity getting conflated with economic and political power.
And, I always saw my faith, so we weren't necessarily, I would say, super religious, but my mom was very much a person who did a lot of volunteer work and did a lot of giving back. And so I had very good modeled behavior that I grew up with. And so I always saw, like, doing good for others was like a core value that I came up with. So I remember going to college and meeting two roommates I had later who came from a very conservative tradition that were going into the medical field. One was going to be a pharmacist and one was going to be a physician's assistant. They were talking about how, they weren't going to provide care to certain people. And it blew my mind because that's not a thing. You can't do that. Like, I don't understand. You take care of people. That's what you do. And it was mind-blowing to me. So to see it happening on such a big scale right now is something I just can't wrap my mind around.
Yeah, and again, putting personal individual beliefs over a greater call to care for people who hold a whole host of beliefs and ideas about things. Again, I just feel like the call of Christianity, in my view, is really about community and less about my personal beliefs about things. And so, yeah, I struggle hearing with that. It's almost like, they're almost being like strident. Very strident in terms of the care they were going to provide. I'm gonna weaponize my viewpoints to keep people from getting the care that they need and deserve.
I really have this strong memory of being like, but you can't do that. That's not a thing. Like, that's not a thing. Like, you legally can't do that. Oh, you can do that. Okay.
Especially if your religious beliefs happen to be conservative Christian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of these things are like, get to like my real core. And for some reason, that's one of those that just really angers me. And I just can't wrap my head around it. Just can't understand refusing to take care of people.
Right. And I think it's in part why, folks in our generation and younger really don't want to participate in formal religious structures because they see the hypocrisy or they see a lack of relevance in their own lives. And really, it makes me sad, but I also totally get it. I really understand why people don't want to participate or hold up institutions where they see them not living into the values that they proclaim. I get it.
So maybe we should take on the big one, which is abortion. And again, you only hear from certain points of view. And when you often hear people of faith talking about abortion, it's very much in the anti-choice vein, and not talking about the value of people who can get pregnant and respecting them.
No, absolutely. And I always like to start conversations like this talking about the history of the clergy consultation service, because it's a part of our history that most people don't know, which is in the years prior to Roe versus Wade, clergy, mostly white Protestant and Jewish rabbis and members of the clergy, and some lay women really, were helping women get access to abortion care when it was illegal, and they felt like that was part of their duty because they saw people dying in their congregations, and it really was a healthcare crisis. And so I like to remember that there have always been people, going back to the text Shifra and Puah of the Hebrew midwives, like there are always people who are making sure that women get the care that they need. And there always has been people of faith in this country who have been advocating for reproductive rights and making sure that women get the health care that they need. But I think that in the years since Roe, the conservatives have done such a good job around controlling the public narrative. And I think part of it is, I think folks in general want to have clarity about life's most complex issues. Things about life and death and why bad things happen. And the talking points from conservatives, religious leaders and political leaders around abortion, they're so clear. They're so clear. And there can be a comfort in that. And I think for those of us who support access to abortion from a faith-based perspective are willing to hold that there's just a lot of stuff that we don't know or understand. And, I think that fetal life does have value, and I think that abortion is a moral decision. And I also believe that every person has the ability to make a decision for themselves about what to do in a time when a pregnancy is just not something that they can sustain for whatever reason. And it's less about when does life begin? When does personhood begin? I don't have clear answers around that, but I do know that when I look at the story overall of kind of who we are as people of faith, there's very little about abortion, but there's a lot about reproductive decision-making and reproductive oppression. And as someone who strives to follow the model of Jesus, as someone who showed compassion and care for the marginalized, I feel like my call is not to judge. It really is to accompany people through difficult moments, including what to do with a pregnancy that is not sustainable for them for whatever reason. And so, that's the message that I bring. And I think that there are folks for whom that answer does not satisfy their questions because they want to know when does life begin and when does personhood begin. I frankly feel like those are questions that are mysterious and sacred, and I don't have clear answers for them. But I am very clear about what my call is. And again, that's to care for my neighbor as I care for myself, and that means caring for people with unintended pregnancies.
I was really brought into this early. I don't know, maybe in 5th or 6th grade. Somebody I went to school with asked me to go with her to go to Madison to go save babies. I mean,
that's a great mission.
Like,
let's go save
right?
some babies.
Like, who is going to say no to that?
Wow.
And I remember going home and all excited and sitting down on a bar stool to talk to my mom. And I'm like, hey, can I go this weekend with so-and-so to go save babies? And she's like, huh. She's like, okay, like, let's sit down and talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very much a conversation about empathy and putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Mm-hmm. And just, okay, have you thought about this scenario? Or what if this is happening? Have you thought about these things?
Mm-hmm.
And then she gave me the agency to make my own choice. Mm-hmm. And she said, okay, so do you still want to go? And I said no, because I thought about the women, because that was how this was, I don't know if I was in 5th grade, like early 90s. So you only thought women, not pregnant people. And I could just think about the women and think you have to respect them and what's going on in their lives. And it also gave me skills going forward of getting information and thinking about other people and other people's perspectives, and then making your choices.
Right. Even to think about just the basic story around Mary and being the mother of Jesus, she agrees to the call, and we don't often talk about her consent. Mm-hmm. And I've often wondered, I wonder if the angel had gone to some other folks first who said, no, thank you. If we ever thought that might be possible, that Mary was the first one to agree, and that perhaps there are others who said, no, I'm not able to do this.
Well, and that takes me back to our earlier conversation with purity culture, mm-hmm. and consent is not something that was talked about. And if it was the girl, it was your responsibility to say mm-hmm. no, is definitely how I was given it.
Absolutely. And then just assuming that a marriage contract means that then consent is implied. I think there's also the other message. And so that was another thing when I think about my friends who are going through marriages where they're their male partners just assumed that like sex was on the table whenever. And again, the messages around purity culture also are harmful to boys in terms of constructions of masculinity, and that the expectation is that you have a super high sex drive, and that's what's going to define your marriage once you get to that point. So yeah, I agree with you. Like, we're not having, within faith communities, we're not having, well, I should say, some of us are not having complex conversations about these really, really tough life issues. And frankly, they should start from the time our kids start talking, or even before, like all the way through, all the way through to the end, because we're all in human relationships all of the time. And consent should be part of all of our relationships.
We're even seeing all of these disparate, like, little bits of conversation we're having right now as separate things, and not seeing that it's one big story about agency and autonomy over your body. So consent, whether I choose to have an abortion, birth control, like, all of these things are just fundamental to my person. And that, again, is something that you're not really taught about in abstinence only, or, I had no I know when you talk about comprehensive sex ed now, it starts much younger with very simple, basic things. And that literally, I had something in, like, I want to say 6th or 7th grade, and that was it.
Wow. So they waited quite a while to have the conversation. Yeah. I mean, I have a 4-year-old daughter, and when she was born, I decided I'm going to use the correct anatomical words for all of her body parts, like, before she could even talk, because for me, it was more about getting comfortable for me saying the words. And then for her, she's never really known any different. But I think even just giving a basic vocabulary to young kids tells them, like, you are then able to claim your body and also to describe what's happening to your body. And some folks just don't even have that basic comfort with, like, their own just anatomy that they're born with. So I've been thinking about, like, what that looks like. And as she's gotten a little bit older, talking about, I don't say, like, give me a hug. I say, may I please have a hug? Just those very, very basic things, which seem, I don't think that we give young children enough respect for their personhood, and that they are human beings with desires and feelings. And if we start early with girls or boys just saying, like, you have to show affection to adults, like, it doesn't challenge that power dynamic that's there. And so I've tried really hard when she's young. I'm sure it will get more complex as she gets older, but just to talk about, like, consent from early on. Like, even though you're younger than I am, you get to decide if physical affection is something you want or not. So it's a work in progress. I think the other thing you're pointing to is that we're kind of all left on our own then to figure out these things. And some of us are able to navigate them okay, but then some people don't have the resources to figure these things out. And we shouldn't leave everybody behind to, like, sort it out without the skills and language that they need to do it.
Again, the healthy relationships thing was something that really affected me later in life. Like, getting in a bad relationship and then not understanding that things that I might have been taught before, that, hey, this is abusive, like, here's a healthy way to navigate that. Like, that didn't exist. And I think even maybe that some of that is timeliness. Like, I think you get more of that now, but probably not in abstinence only.
So one of the redeeming things I think about faith communities and why they are, I think, still useful is that it's one of the few institutions that I'm aware of that touches people throughout the lifespan, from birth to death. And so there are these great opportunities to have intergenerational conversations in places that they might not otherwise be happening. And I think if we could get to the point where we could have these kind of rich conversations, the faith communities are a wonderful spot to have them.
So I want to take it back to your book, because there was a sentence in here that really struck me as just so true. And it was towards the end, and you talk about how the fastest way to extinguish a woman's power is to raise questions about her sexuality.
Yeah. So I was talking specifically about Mary Magdalene in that chapter because it talked about feeling angry about something. The history of interpretation around her has always put her as this other woman in the text who is nameless and who is sinful. And so she gets conflated with that story because of a pope back in the day. And also the sin is assumed to be a sexual sin. And so it really has disempowered the legacy of Mary Magdalene, who is the first witness of the resurrection, who is told to go and preach the good news. And instead, the history around her has become obsessed with her sexuality.
Yeah.
And so I think there's so much resonance for today. And gosh, even thinking about going into an election cycle and seeing all these amazing women candidates. I don't know. I haven't been as tuned in, but I can just imagine the kinds of things that are being said about their bodies or how they show up or what they look like. Or we certainly saw that when Hillary Clinton was running for president. And it seems like the quickest way to just like shut down any other conversation about a woman is to just make assumptions about her sexuality, whether or not they're based in truth.
Yeah. That would just, I don't know, it just really jumped out at me when I saw it. And I was like, that is so true.
Yeah. And the double standards for men, right? I mean, there's just not the same baggage. And it goes back to the purity culture thing, right? Like women are supposed to be beautiful and they're supposed to be attractive. But as soon as someone responds to that in a way, we're supposed to like shut our sexuality off. And so there's just no way to win.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely the idea of shaming very much built in. So if you do decide to have sex, like it's built right in, right? Like your chewed gum or
yes,
the tape that doesn't stick.
Yes.
Or what was the one I saw recently? Spit in a cup, I think was the one I saw recently.
Oh, yeah, you're used up and dirty and yeah, I've heard it's amazing how those kinds of analogies show up everywhere. I'm like, who are the people that are spreading these analogies around about like people who've had sex or used up? And the one I talked about was like the ripped package, right? Like you wouldn't give someone a present where all the packaging has been ripped. So I'm like, oh gosh, this is really troubling. And I think it goes to even more of a control because it's not just about like intercourse. It's about like really you're not supposed to engage your sexuality at all. You're supposed to cut it off. And then as soon as marriage comes, then you're supposed to turn it on. Like it's a light switch. It's just so impractical. Ugh.
And then you'll be happy for like never having experienced anything.
Right. As you
get married and woo, everything's perfect.
Out. It makes no sense. Like there's no logic there. And you know, for me, I call myself the compassionate pragmatist. It's like I want to have real conversations with people about things instead of operating in this like fantasy thinking because it just doesn't make sense. And so I think I come from a faith tradition, United Methodism, that really values reason and learning. And I just feel like we've got to combine that with our ancient teachings and our theology. And we've got to use our brains as well as our hearts when we talk about these things.
So we've touched on a lot of kind of general myths that people of faith all believe X or Y. Do you have any other ones that you want to touch on?
Around sexuality specifically? Being a minister now, people think that ministers don't swear. And I can assure you that that's not true. We do swear and we are human.
I like that one.
Some of us like alcohol occasionally. So yeah, but I think just the expectation that ministers are somehow above or not fully human. We are fully human and we make mistakes too.
No, I think that's a good one. And especially coming from the Catholic Church where it's very much framed that way, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like the Pope is infallible and like that's very much of the tradition I was taught. Where
that's a heavy burden.
Yeah,
I'm thankful I don't have
imagine.
that. I'm thankful I don't have that on my shoulders because, goodness, that would be a lot. That would be a heavy burden to carry.
With all of this and all the things happening right now around reproductive health and rights, how can people of faith fight back? How can they engage in this?
So I think what we're seeing now with the abortion bans being so extreme that I do think people are asking the question, what can I do if I've done nothing before? So I would say, one, if you are someone who's in a faith community already, are there people that you might just broach the subject with and see if there are other people who feel the same way? I would also encourage you, if you want to do activism, to kind of bring that to the people who are already on the ground doing the work and saying, hey, I'm a person of faith and I want to support you. What's a way that I could partner? And I also think just doing some exploration around how your faith and your beliefs inform your position on this issue and start talking about it and getting good at saying it out loud, because I think what happens is there are people who, say I'm pro-choice and I'm a person of faith, but they don't know how to talk about those things together. So just do some exploration. I mean, you can pick up my book, Women Rise Up, and maybe study some of the passages that you haven't seen before, and just start kind of crafting for yourself your own narrative that feels authentic to your faith, that you would feel comfortable sharing in conversation with people, maybe even publicly if you have a platform for it. Because I think we've got to talk to conservatives who are using faith language. We have to speak back to them with faith language in order for us to have any hope of having a conversation that brings us all together. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Like, look for people who feel the same way, start diving into the sacred text, and start practicing what it means to talk as a person of faith who supports reproductive rights.
Yeah, and I think having those conversations is so important because I think right now people assume silence is agreement.
Absolutely. Yes. And I have been watching for organizations and people to speak out in this moment. And some of them I've been surprised have been willing to speak out for the first time. And so the other thing I would say is, if you are going to put yourself out there, let folks know ahead of time so that when the backlash comes, you are going to be held. And if the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice can be helpful, I would encourage you all to reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk with you about what's going on in your local community and connect you to the people that we know.
Yeah. Well, Katey, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
And everybody, make sure to check out Katey's book, Women Rise Up, and we will include it in the show notes along with links to her podcast, so you can also listen to her and her co-host Ashley talk about amazing things around feminism and faith. For more information, including show notes from this episode and previous episodes, please visit our website at reprosfightback.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at reprosfightback. If you like our show, please help others find it by sharing it with your friends and subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on iTunes. Thanks for listening.